I want to speak to you about communication. Communication is really one of the most regular things we do as human beings. Do you mind switching the slides over, Sid? Thanks. Communication is one of the most regular things we do as human beings. We communicate, most of us here, maybe all of us here, on a daily basis, maybe even every other hour we're communicating. Or if we're not communicating, then we're being the receiver of someone else's communication, right? Even when we're sleepless, restless in the bed in the middle of the night on our smartphones, we're looking at somebody else's communication, whether it be an article, a social media post, a YouTube video, selfies, pictures sent from family members. That all counts as communication. Even people that have occupations where they're away from other human beings for months at a time, the vast majority of those people are still embroiled in communication because usually they have to keep pretty strict records of what they're doing while they're out by themselves. And so if communication is so important to our general lives as human beings, then it makes sense that the Bible would have something to say about it. And also, when you really think about it, communications has a lot to do with what we do as Christians. Right now, I am communicating with you. When we pray, we are communicating with God. When we sing songs of praises, that's communication. When we edify, when we build each other up, that's communication. When we rebuke one another, that's communication. When we spread the gospel, that's communication. When we study our Bible, that's God communicating with us. Communication is just such a major part of not only life as a human, but life as a Christian. And so I want to talk about communication tonight. And I can't cover, in the time that we have allotted this evening, everything there is to know about communication in the Bible, let alone secularly, either one of those things really. Because you get these people with doctorates in communications and all them, where they spend their entire life one facet of communication. And we already know the Bible is an endless well of knowledge. But what I want to focus on tonight, I'm not going to focus on lies. When we are talking about communication within the confines of tonight's lesson, I want to go from the idea that we are speaking honestly with each other. We're writing honestly with each other. Whatever it is honest communication. We know that lies are wrong. We've had sermons on lies, right? Colossians 3, 9, and 10 says, "Do not lie to one another, seeing you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator." We have so many verses, that just being one of them in the Bible, about the sin of lies. So we're not going to focus on that. What I want to focus on is general communication, both from a secular aspect, as kind of a, there's some neat kind of college things I learned years ago about communication. And then I want to talk about general communication from a biblical aspect. And then I want to get more specific with talking about how to communicate with non-Christians, then how to communicate with Christians, and then a little subsection right at the end about rebuke. But first, let's look at general communication, right? As I said, it comes in so many forms. There's speaking, public, like I'm doing now, or otherwise. Private one-on-one conversations, just chatting around a campfire or a living room. The speaking comes in so many different forms. Letters, articles, text messages, phone calls, social media posts, photos, videos, body language. It's called body language, right? It involves communication. And the reason I have some of these, letters, articles, text messages, those are all textual communication. But they also are very different forms of communication. What you write in a letter is not the same thing you write in a text message. And because of that, there are some really differences in the kind of message you can send people and how people receive those messages. Depending, a phone call is very different from speaking to someone face to face because you can't see their body language and their tone may get distorted by signal loss or this, that, and the other, and you may miss words. There's a lot of difference even when we're thinking about what at first seems very similar forms of communication. And communication comes with many difficulties. And if there's one thing I want to look at, and if there's one thing I want you to take away from this study, it's something I mentioned a few weeks ago when I had the short talk, and that's that communication is difficult, and because it's difficult, and because none of us are perfect, especially perfect communicators, I don't know any of us here that would claim to be a perfect speaker or a perfect listener. And I think there's very few people in the world that could claim it, and very few people that would be correct if they do, if any. And so because communication is so difficult, I think we as Christians need to remember that and to be a little lenient, depending on the circumstances. Some circumstances deserve more leniency than others, with how other people communicate, and to be merciful and kind of forgiving maybe if they slip up with their communication, to understand their intentions behind it. Because not all of us are perfect communicators. We may use the wrong word, or the sentence may be phrased wrong or ordered wrong, and it may have a different meaning technically than what the speaker meant it to have. But as Christians, we can take our time when listening and when thinking, especially among other Christians who we should be able to trust, right? And think well and be lenient with that. That's one of the things I really want you to take away from this sermon. But one of the things I picked up from college is a graph kind of similar to this. And it details a way at looking at communication. And the way it is we have, let me flip my notes over here. There we go. We have the sender. See if this actually works, because I haven't used it. Not really. I'm not going to worry about the laser pointing. We have the sender, who would be me. We'll use the sermon right now as an example for this. I'm the sender. I'm sending my message to you. This encoding step is the kind of transfer of my thoughts to my words. And encodings is different for every person. I'm assisted by my notes, but it's primarily my thoughts, right? So it depends on what I know, my vocabulary, who I am as a person, what I've experienced over my life, the people I've come in contact with that shaped who I am today, right? And so what I'm preaching on communication may not be the same thing you hear from someone else preaching on the same subject, right? We experience that a lot. There's a lot of common topics when it comes to sermons that you see many, many different preachers talk about. And although you've heard this, talk about marriage and divorce and remarriage from 5, 10, maybe more preachers, each one of them doesn't say the exact same thing. They may use the exact same verses. They may come to the exact same conclusion. But the content itself is not beat for beat the same, and that's because these are different people with different thoughts, different experiences. And so it becomes encoded. That process of thoughts to words is different from person to person, even though it's the same topic from the same source, the Bible. Also, it may be altered, what I think versus what I speak, based off of what my emotions are, willingly or unwillingly, right? And I say unwillingly, and you get real angry and you can't hardly help but say something. Now, granted, that's a lack of self-control, right? But you get the point there where your emotions get the better of you. You may be sad, you may be angry, right? You may be happy, and that changes the way you send your message. You may have a grudge against the receiver, the person you're speaking to, and that may change how your thoughts get translated into your words, right? There's other variables like that. Those are things to pay attention to when it comes to encoding, and that's one of the things that you need to, or that I would recommend being lenient about, right? Understand that sometimes people get heated. Understand that sometimes people get really sad and really depressed and really distraught. And that adjusts what they say and what they think. And we sometimes hear that we say things we don't mean, right? And we do know the Bible talks about, and I'll come up on the verse again and again in the sermon, that the Bible talks about, what proceeds from the mouth comes from the heart. And so, but we can still say things without thinking. A lot of that comes from kind of issues, flaws in that encoding process, because we are affected by our emotions, are affected by other things. But then once my thoughts turn into speech, or turn into, in the example of the sermon, then it becomes the message. It becomes what you're hearing now. And then it moves to decoding, which is the opposite of encoding, right? It is where my words reach your ears, and then they become your thoughts, what you understand as the message. And that decoding process is very similar to the encoding process, and that it depends on who you are as a person, what your vocabulary is, what language you speak. If I speak English and you speak Japanese, you're not going to decode very much from my conversation, right? Or if I use large words, fancy words, rarely used words that you may not know for one reason or another, then you're going to miss parts of my conversation. And you're going to either not understand them at all, or you may assume a word I say means one thing when I may think it means something entirely different. And that may change what you get out of that message. And once again, emotions and all that can interfere with how the message is received. And then there's feedback, which is body language, right? Whether y'all are shifting in your seats, or looking down at your phones, or looking at your watch, right? That's feedback from a public speaking standpoint. But then if you're in a one-on-one conversation, feedback may be someone responding to you physically or verbally, right? It depending on the communication. Social media post feedback may be a comment on the post, right? Or just the fact that someone has liked the post is feedback. And then noise is maybe one of the most important kind of things to pay attention to when it comes to leniency. And noise is really anything that distorts the message itself, right? Now, your thoughts may be distorted, like the message may be distorted before it becomes a message by the encoding, or distorted after it reaches someone by their decoding, right? By how they think about the message before they send it, how they receive the message, how they think about the person and the words that they've heard. But noise is anything that disturbs the message kind of in transit. And that can be physical noise, right? Or it can be more than physical noise. Let's say, for example, that while I'm preaching right now, ER starts snoring, right? And that becomes noise. Now, he may not be snoring very loudly, but that also is still noise because it's a distraction. Even if it's not physically interrupting the sound from my mouth to your ears, then it is still a distraction. It still becomes noise. Phones are noise. They're a distraction. People are looking down at their phones, doing this and that. That's noise that interrupts the message. That's noise that I often fall prey to, something I have a flaw with. But then there's anything else. Motorcycles going down the highway, that's physical noise. A child that's misbehaving, a row in front of you or beside you, that's noise. Spelling error on my slides, which I might have, but I've tried to avoid, that's noise. A joke that's too funny, that's noise, because you're no longer paying attention to the words I speak. Your mind's still back on that joke I said 5 minutes earlier, right? My allergies may be noise because I have to stop and sneeze and cough in the middle of the sermon. That's still noise that interferes. And, there's lots of other examples of noise, but that can interfere with the message. And once again, it's like there's some leniency to give there as the speaker and as the hearer to wherever there may be an error in communication, because we're not perfect. The world's not perfect. And so we need to be merciful with each other a little bit. So to summarize that, it's like as the sender, you need to pay attention to your encoding. You need to plan your words so the receiver can understand your message. Which in public speaking, that also often means using the simplest speech possible, because you're speaking to the broadest audience. Which really means that maybe I should have the slide this way, right? That just says instead of using these fancy college words or these lesser used college words, these college terminology like sender and receiver and encoding and decoding, I just tell you that when you communicate, you need to think before you speak. You need to be understandable. And that being understandable depends a lot on the audience. If I'm speaking to people with doctorate degrees, then I can use languages that suit whatever their education may be. If I'm speaking to doctors, medical doctors, I can talk about medical terms almost as complex as I want to. And they're going to understand it or know how to understand it. But if I start talking engineering terms to those medical doctors, they may not get anything, right? Even though they're both very intelligent, educated groups of people. So you want to alter based on your audience. And that even counts in one-on-one. I'm using public speaking because I'm speaking publicly, but all this stuff still counts for one-on-one conversations with people you're with. Or just group conversations, sitting around the dining room table or the living room, talking with family and friends, talking on social media. And then pay attention to feedback, right? Make sure you know what your listener is thinking to the best of your ability. Know how they're responding to your message. If you need to adjust how you're saying, what you're saying, stop and let them communicate maybe, depending on the situation, right? There's a lot of things you need to pay attention to when you're the one doing the speaking regarding how your listener is receiving it. And then when you listen or read or however you're receiving a message, you need to pay attention. Because that's your responsibility to reduce noise, is your attention to whoever's doing the speaking, whoever's doing the writing that you're reading. You need to be attentive to it. And then, same as I said earlier, you need to have that certain amount of leniency, more or less depending on the situation, right? Some situations, you give people a lot of leniency with messing up. Some situations, usually more serious ones like preaching and teaching the word, there's very little leniency to be had. But there's still a little bit. I've tripped over my words 2 or 3 times already in this sermon. And I assume none of y'all hold that against me, right? That's leniency. And maybe there's a little more you can give, but I doubt there's any less you can give, right? And of course, eliminate all possible noise. And that counts for both sides of people. And that's something I have trouble with, because I already mentioned cell phones get distracting, smartphones get distracting. But just in anything outside of the church, inside of the church, just whatever causes a distortion, a loss of information between whoever's doing the speaking and whoever's doing the listening, you need to reduce that. The more important the conversation, the more you need to pay attention to how much noise needs to be reduced. But let's move on from the secular rules of communication to the biblical rules of communication, because that's what's really important here. The secular rules are helpful, right? And worldly wisdom does help to some extent, but biblical wisdom is really where it's at. So first, let's read from Ephesians chapter 4, 29 through 32. It says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed away for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." And I forgot to mention, but unless I say otherwise, I'll be reading from the English Standard Version this sermon. So what we get from this passage is we are to avoid evil things in our speech, right? We don't want corrupting talk to come out of our mouth. We want to be kind. We want to be tender-hearted. We want to be forgiving, right? You give grace to those who hear, it says, right? All these wrath and anger and clamor and slander, right? These are things that are to be avoided when we communicate. And we have Colossians 4:6. It says, "Let your speech always be gracious, Season with salt so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Speak graciously. And then, like I said earlier, even talking about secular knowledge about communication, you adjust your speech. And sometimes, really, when you think about it, you adjust your listening to match the person you're speaking to or the person you're listening to, right? Because people are different. Not a one of us are the same. And because of that, you need to kind of be aware of what your listener knows, what your speaker knows, the way they talk, the experiences they have, and how that benefits the conversation. And you've noticed that I've been repetitive a little bit, and it's going to be a lot more repetitive because the Bible tends to say the same thing much more than once. I'm going to be using a lot of different verses. I'm going to repeat a few verses once or twice. But the verses are really all going to boil down to the same handful of things. Continuing forward, we have more verses. Proverbs 18:12 says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame. And this is another thing I personally sometimes have a problem with, which is let people finish their sentence before you answer the question. It is in the Bible to let people finish talking before you speak. I have a problem with that. I tend to interrupt people. But it is something I need to get better at because it is something recommended by Proverbs, which is often worldly wisdom, but it's inspired worldly wisdom. Some of the best you can ever get. 2 Timothy 2:16 says, but avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness. I saw E.R. use this towards the beginning of his sermon this morning. I said, I hope there's not a lot of overlap. Luckily, I was fine, and he went a completely different direction. But when the third and fourth verse, I think, of the sermon in the mornings, two of the same verses you use, you start to sweat a little. Some versions, when it comes to this verse, they call it empty speech, godless discussions, pointless discussions, useless worldly things. That's different translations for that irreverent babble there. A way to think about it is all those what-if conversations. The one that always comes to my mind is people that think baptism isn't necessary for salvation, right? They say, well, what if they're on the way to be baptized and they have a car accident and they die? What then, right? Or sometimes they get I've seen some really extreme and silly what-if conversations that have religious connotations or that don't even have anything to do with religion, right? And the Bible warns us against those, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, right? These kind of the pointless discussions, useless worldly things, godless discussions, irreverent babble, empty speech, right? That's something to be avoided in our communication. It's a commandment in the Bible to watch that, and to avoid that. Colossians 3 verse 8 says, but now you must put them all away. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. That's very similar to what we read just a moment ago in Ephesians. Right? As I said, the Bible repeats itself a lot, and for good reason. It needs to, and it emphasizes every time the Bible says it. That's just more emphasis on how important it is. We need to communicate. We need to speak. We need to write. We need to post on social media. Whatever it is we do with our communication, it needs to be without anger and wrath and malice and slander and obscene talk. There's more verses about crude humor and all that beyond this one about obscene talk we'll get to in just a moment. James 1:19 says, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. That whole passage about James, about controlling the tongue in James, we're very familiar with. But as general rules of communication, we think before we speak. But we're very quick to hear, very quick to listen. And once again, the Bible has said so many times already, and will continue to say, be calm when you speak. Don't be angry. Slow to anger. Speak without anger or wrath. We've seen that already, and we'll continue to see that that is a key part of communicating with a Christian attitude. Continuing with more verses, Matthew 15:18-19 says, but what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. if we want to be good communicators, if we want to communicate in a Christian manner, then we need to have self-control not only of our speech but of our thoughts. Because Jesus said, what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. If you want to control your tongue, if you want to be a good communicator, and even a good listener, then you need to have your thoughts under self-control so that they don't stray to non-Christian things, so that they're focused either on speaking or on listening. We need to guard our thoughts against evil to improve our communication skills. And more so than that, we need to guide our thoughts towards good. Philippians 4 verse 8 says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And so if Jesus says in Matthew 15 that what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, then you can tie that in real easy to Philippians 4:8. And if you want what comes out of the mouth to be good things, then your mind needs to be on these good things in Philippians 4:8. Ephesians 5:4, that's that verse I was saying we'll get to that talks in even more detail about the dangers, the sin of crude humor. It says, let there be no filthiness, nor foolish joking, no foolish talk, no crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. So much of the humor today is non-Christian when you really look at it and think about it. Even in, it's starting to seep in even to kids' movies, where some of the jokes and stuff are, I guess it really, if you paid attention, it's been in there for a while, just kind of hidden where only the adults would see it and the kids wouldn't understand. That crude humor, worldly humor, things that are not what falls under Philippians 4:8, makes their way into communication constantly. And really it proliferates because the more people see it and they think it's funny, so they're going to share it. And with social media, it spreads like wildfire, anything that's even the least amount of popular. But when we communicate, we need to avoid those non-Christian jokes, those filthy jokes, those one thing I have trouble with is dark humor, right? That's not necessarily dirty or inappropriate, but may have connotations of maybe death and harm in it. I've gotten a lot better about that, but there is a short moment where jokes like that were something that I would say without thinking, and I'd be like, ooh, that was a bit off, right? And that happens a lot where you get so embroiled in the what's funny on these TikTok videos or these Facebook posts. And even if you don't share it with someone because you know better, because it makes its way into your thoughts and into your heart, then there's a time or two where you just spout off something that becomes inspired by something you saw earlier. And there your communication becomes tainted. It becomes non-Christian. Continuing forward, we have a longer verse here, longer passage. 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23 says, for though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them its blessings. This is another one of those verses where we adjust our communication, both the speakers and listeners, to match the people we're around. And as Paul says here, we don't step outside of the bounds of the Bible by doing so. We stay within the confines of what we ought to do and not do as Christians, right? He says, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. But we adjust how we say, what we say, so that we make the people around us feel welcome, feel comfortable. while still very strictly being under and within God's law. Let's see. Let's move forward then. And let's talk about communicating with non-Christians. Actually, one last note. It was on the back side of the page, so I didn't see it right off. One example for when it comes to, right here in 1 Corinthians, is let's say you are trying to convert to Christianity someone who's Muslim, right? And a lot of the Muslims have very strict dress codes, especially for women, right? If you're trying to convert someone that's Muslim, you may dress a lot more conservative, and let's say you're a woman and you're trying to have a Bible study with someone that's Islamic. You may dress much more conservatively for that Bible study than you would normally. And that's not saying you approve of their religion, right? That's just becoming something to someone that you may reach them, right? And that's part of communication. How you dress is part of communication. If I came up here and I was in a t-shirt and basketball shorts while doing the sermon, that would affect my communication, even though it's just the way I dress. There's so much that affects your communication. And so there's a lot you can do to become all things to all people, to reach them, to save them, right? Just something to think about, and that's an entire lesson really in and of itself that can be done another time. But moving forward on the communicating with non-Christians. First thing we need to do is we need to be a good influence. Philippians 2:15 says that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Both your actions and your words, directly and indirectly, impact your influence. The way you communicate, the way you listen even to someone. Because if they're pouring their heart out to you because they think, well, this is a good person, he's a Christian, right? We have those moments. A lot of us, I've heard stories, have those moments where a coworker comes to you and they ask you for prayers. Because while they may not be a Christian, while they may be a non-Christian, or they may be someone who claims to be a Christian but doesn't really follow God's word, they understand that you are a righteous person and they come to you. And if you are distracted, if you are not a good listener to the problems that they are giving to you, they're going to think less of you. It's going to be much harder to reach them, to save them, because they're going to think about, well, what about that time where I really wanted their opinion, where I really wanted their prayers, and they were distracted by whatever video was on their phone, or they were talking to someone else and didn't stop to listen to the problem I had. And there's a lot of other examples as well. Your actions and your words directly and indirectly impact your influence. And as I already said, actions are just as much communications as words are. I'm sitting here, as I'm up here, I like to use my hands a lot. I think a lot of y'all may have noticed that. But that's still part of communication. If you're on social media, on YouTube, on TikTok, there's some videos where people don't say a word. And it's just them doing something. But they're still communicating. I see videos, a lot of times I'll watch them if I'm having some sort of technical issue. And it's just someone going through the steps to solve that technical issue. And they may not say a word the entire video, but they're providing communication, right? So you can communicate a lot through your actions without saying anything. And so we should be careful about that as we shine as lights in the world. Titus 2:7-8 says, show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works. And in your teaching, show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us. We are to be a model of good works, model of sound speech, right? Sound speech protects us against enemies of the faith. If we are Christian communicators in our words, in our messages on social media, in our actions, in our body language, then that provides a defense against those that would call us hypocrites. Because that's where communication can really run into butt heads with non-Christians. Is you may say something, you may say a joke that's a little off color. And then someone else may say a joke that's a lot more off color. And then you say, hey, that's not right, that's not okay. And they say, well, you said such and such a bit ago, right? Or you may do something. Your actions may show approval for something. It may communicate that you approve something, even though as a Christian you shouldn't. And then when you use words to show disapproval, they think about those actions you had earlier. And they call you a hypocrite out for it. So our communication, our sound speech, our being a model of good works is so important when communicating with non-Christians, because it protects us against enemies of the faith. It protects us against, it gives our, as it says, so opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us. When communicating with non-Christians, we need to be ready to defend the faith. 1 Peter 3:15 says, but in your hearts honor Christ, the Lord is holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. That's the thing we're going to start seeing a lot. We've seen it a little bit, but this is a phrase we're going to see a lot as well as we go through more of these Bible verses. It's this idea of being gentle and respectful in our communication. When we defend our faith, we don't need to get really emotional, really riled up, really angry, really accusatory, really proud. We need to be gentle. We need to be respectful when we communicate with non-Christians, when we defend the faith, because the Bible says so. 2 Timothy 4:2 says, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. So once again, we need to be ready to defend. We need to be ready to teach. We need to be ready to encourage. Encouraging is such an important part about communication, not just with non-Christians, but as we'll get to in a moment, especially with Christians. Encouraging becomes so very important. Building each other up becomes so very important. And then once again, when we rebuke, when we defend the faith, there's that patience that needs to be had. There's that attitude really of being calm and careful, and maybe even taking things a little slow, right? When you think of patience, when you think of gentleness, when you think of respectfulness, you don't think about going into something headfirst 60 miles an hour. You think of taking it cautiously, you think of taking it easily when it comes to defending the faith. Because one of the things, as I said, that becomes such a big issue when you as a Christian are reaching out to non-Christians, particularly in this day and age, is accusations of hypocrisy. And if you take it easy, you're a lot less likely to run across a statement that allows someone that crack in there to accuse you of hypocrisy and then to just throw out your entire argument because they can make that accusation. Whether or not that accusation is really accurate, a lot of people will just look for an excuse to call you a hypocrite and then throw everything they can out the window. Another thing is, when communicating with non-Christians, we should not be corrupted. Romans 12 verse 2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, but what is good and acceptable and perfect, right? We are to, when communicating with non-Christians, we are not to let their non-Christian communication back to us taint our righteousness. Because people of the world, they like the dirty humor. They like the crude humor, the jesting, the empty conversations that the Bible warns against. And while we are receiving communication from them, because communication is almost never, and really is never, a one-way street. Even if you write an article, people sometimes comment on it. You may get letters in the mail, social media posts, emails to you as responses, feedback from that article. Communication is rarely ever purely a one-way street. And so whatever that communication may be, you need to be careful about whatever corrupting effect it could have. Of course, that doesn't mean you shun non-Christians altogether, right? We've already gone through verses about communicating with people that aren't of the faith, but we can look at an example from Jesus. Jesus in Matthew 9, 10 through 12, it says, "And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples." Reclining at table, I've mentioned this in some capacity, but I don't know if I've mentioned it to the full congregation. But what reclining at table is when you would go eat and go spend time and go socialize with people back in that day and age. They didn't have chairs and tables like we have now. Much rather, the tables would be much lower to the ground, and there would be maybe cushions or other kind of soft objects around the table, and you would really just kind of lean like this, legs out away from the table, and the table would sometimes be shaped in like a U shape. That way everyone could kind of face each other, depending on, whether or not you had the money and the resources for that. And you would recline up against the table, basically laying down. And it was very much like, kind of if people were chatting in the living room, but also snacking and drinking at the same time. It's that kind of very social experience. So Jesus wasn't just, going for a quick meal and then leaving. He was spending time with these people. And it says in verse 11, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. We are to be like Christ. There's so many verses about how we are to use Jesus as our example. And so if we are to use Jesus as our example, and Jesus is willing to spend time socializing with non-Christians, then that means that we should be willing to do the same. Now, we are to not be conformed to the world. We are to draw a line in the sand to prevent corruption. That means if coworkers say, hey, you want to go get a bite to eat? Or, hey, you want to come to my son's birthday party or my birthday party at my house? Then you can say, yeah, sure, maybe. But if they say, you want to go out to the bar? We're all going out to the bar after work. Then you got to draw that line. You say no. Because even if you go there and you just have a drink of water and you drive everybody home afterwards, that's still becoming more conformed to the world. That's still kind of crossing that line a little bit. That's still risking that corruption in their communication and your actions. One of the other things we ought to do when communicating with non-Christians is we are to show disapproval for sin. That's a big thing about communication. It's something that stuck with me Thursday in the meeting, right? And this verse is from last week's Thursday sermon about through the Psalms. Psalms 101 verse 3 says, I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless. I hate the work of those who fall away. It shall not cling to me. We are to be very clear in our communication that we disapprove of sin. And that could be verbal communicating. Hey, that's bad. Hey, you shouldn't do that. Or that could be very much an example of we just turn away. We just walk into another room. That's still communication. That's still communicating our disapproval. I haven't watched the movie, but I've heard of a classic movie, and I can't remember the name of it right off. But it's an old black and white movie, and it takes place almost entirely within a room where a jury is deliberating over whether or not a boy killed someone. And somebody from the scene that I watched, or from the description, I don't think I actually watched the scene from the movie, but someone was describing it. Somebody gets really racist because the boy that did it was not a white boy in this movie. And he starts getting really belligerent and really angry. And what happens is one of the other jurors in that deliberation room, he gets up from the table and he just faces away from him. And then one by one, everyone else, they just get up from what they're doing and they face the wall. They ignore him. They don't say a word, but they communicate their disapproval for his immoral actions. And eventually he just shuts up and stops. And that'll happen in real life just as much as it happened in that one movie scene. But we don't need to be proud when we do it, right? Pride is something we ought to avoid as Christians. There's entire sermons on that as well. Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." The damage your pride can do on its own is great. Think about, once again, that idea of hypocrisy. If you get proud with how you treat someone else, and then you get caught up in hypocrisy because you slip up, then the damage you have done to your reputation just because you were proud on top of slipping up is really, really immense among non-Christians. Ephesians 4:1-2 says, "Therefore, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love." We are to be humble as Christians, and that includes, there is no exception for how we communicate. Humility is how we walk. Humility, we should be embodying humility in our communication with non-Christians, in our communication with Christians, in our actions, and everything we do. And once again, that gentleness, there's that patience in our communication and really every aspect of our life as Christians. So let's move forward and let's talk about communicating with Christians. The first thing we ought to do is very similar to the first thing we're doing with non-Christians. We ought to be a good influence. 1 Timothy 4:12 says, "Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, and faith, and purity." We are to be an example in our speech, in our conduct, in our communication to one another as Christians. Let me get a drink here. I'm lucky I'm the only person with access to water in the entire building. All right. It's just a good influence. I believe I preached a sermon on it before, not long ago. Just how important it is to have good influence as a Christian, both to non-Christians and to other Christians. And a lot of our influence comes from our communication, because that's really how people get to understand who we are, is how we communicate with them, how we communicate with other people while they're around, whether that be communication through words or communication through actions. How we listen to other people so much as how we speak to them and what we listen to. The other thing we ought to do is we should not quarrel with new or weak Christians. Romans 14 verses 1-4 says, "As for one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats. For God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand." Helping someone, edifying someone, educating someone, strengthening them as a Christian is one thing. But getting in a quarrel and an argument, right, bickering back and forth among things is not the way of a Christian. Another thing, and as I said, this is important as Christians. I mentioned this earlier. Building each other up is important. Encouragement is important. 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 11-14 say, "Therefore encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And we encourage you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all." So encouragement, very key. And encouragement is communication. I find it very hard to encourage people without communicating something. Even, once again, if we go to actions over words, that can still be encouraging. There are many people here whose actions have encouraged me, but that's still them communicating to me. I'm not receiving any encouragement without some sort of communication from them, even if it's just their action. And once again, we have patience, right? Peace among yourselves. That kind of idea of being slow and deliberate and calm and cautious with our communication. Maybe cautious is the wrong word. But you understand that anger and wrath and slander and all those things have been repeatedly spoken against in the Bible. Hebrews 3:13 says, "But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." Right? Encourage, exhortation, very important things to do when communicating with other Christians. So let's get into the last little bit. And this may be the most detailed bit. I think a lot of sermons, there comes to a time where the person doing the preaching is like, this is where things get, I don't know, the word has escaped me. But there's a little bit of focus I want to put here, regardless. And that's when we talk about rebuking. First, when we rebuke others, once again, patience is key. Just like our general communication, just like all these other verses we've mentioned, patience is so key when rebuking. We've mentioned 2 Timothy 4:2 already. We'll read it again. Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with complete patience and teaching. Patience when rebuking and reproving, right? It says right there. Luke 17:3-4 says, "Pay attention to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times in the day and turns to you 7 times, saying, 'I repent,' you must forgive him." You have patience with your fellow Christians when rebuking them. And rebuking is very key communication. Because if we could not rebuke one another as Christians and everybody could run around, nobody other than God could tell them that they were doing wrong. And that would become very difficult for a lot of people to stay on the straight and narrow. We are to be forgiving, be patient, even if they sin repeatedly, as we get from Luke. We are to be gentle. Once again, we covered verses already that talk about gentleness. Galatians 6:1 also mentions it. It says, "Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted." The spirit of gentleness, this patience, this attitude that we should enforce on our communication, not only in this subsection here about rebuking, but in general. It's important because if we get emotional, if we get angry, if we lose control over our thoughts and our tongues due to these emotions, then we risk sinning ourselves. It says, "Lest you too be tempted." Once again, as I've said multiple times, and as the Bible has said multiple times, we are to kind of adjust our attitude based off of the person we're communicating with, whether it be as a speaker or as a listener. 1 Timothy 5:1 says, "Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father, younger men as brothers." And it goes forward from there. But the word rebuke here is only used here in the Bible. The Greek word used for rebuke here is only used here. And the reason is, and I think this translation doesn't do it a ton of justice, and a lot of them don't, because a lot of the translations just say rebuke here. But the Greek word here is sharply rebuke. Really, and it's kind of a compound word, and I'm not a Greek scholar, but from what little I can put together from Strong's, is that it's a word basically put together between rebuke and also even to strike, to beat, to smite in rebuke, right? That's like extremely sharp, extremely emotional, right? And that's the kind of rebuke we are to avoid. Not only with those older than us, but with those younger than us, right? We are to treat people with respect. We are to treat people as brothers, as siblings, as parents when we rebuke and reprove them. That's that gentleness. That's that also adjusting our attitude based off the person. It is almost impossible to have quality conversation treating someone who is 60 years old the same as you treat a 5-year-old kid, right? The 60-year-old man ain't going to take being treated as a 5-year-old very well. And the 5-year-old ain't going to get very much out of being treated like a 60-year-old man. And it's not just age, it's really other facets, a lot of other aspects of how people are. Maybe their education, maybe what they do for a living, maybe their strength as a Christian, maybe what sins they have fallen temptation to in the past. That all changes how you go about communicating with someone, specifically with rebuke here, but in general. And I've said that, and the Bible has said that multiple times. When we rebuke, we are to do so with authority. And I think that's important because when we're rebuking someone, we should be using Scripture. And the Scripture gives us authority. And if we aren't certain that we can have authority when we rebuke someone, then maybe we ought to go to the Scriptures and find it before we speak. Titus 2:15 says, "Declare these things, exhort and rebuke with all authority. Let no one disregard you." So if you can't follow this verse in Titus when you're rebuking someone, then you back up until you can. And this is where things get, I guess this is where I was talking earlier, where things get a little deep, maybe, or where the issue may lie. Matthew 18:15 through 17, right? I think this verse may stick in our minds a little because of somewhat recent situations with the congregation. Actually, it's been a little while now, but I don't know if any of us will ever forget it. But Matthew 18:15 through 17 says, "If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to this church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector." Step 1, if you have a problem with a brother, if they have sinned against you, go to your brother alone. Communicate between the two of you alone. If that fails, move to step 2. Step 2, take 2 or 3 people that can witness the accusations. If it fails, move to step 3. And this step 2 is where what I've been mentioning. And that's because I think this is often misunderstood. Verse 16, specifically the latter half of verse 16, I think is often misunderstood. So here's a bunch of different versions of the Bible that all have this latter half of verse 16. ESV says that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. New King James Version says that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. American Standard Version says that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses or 3, every word may be established. NIV says every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. New Living Translation, which is these last 2 are very, if you're not aware of them, they're very loose translations, very modern tongue. But they are still translations people use. And while they may not be paragons of translational accuracy, they are still translations of the Bible that you will see other people use. You will, especially among, I guess, more denominational people who claim to be Christians. New Living Translation says, so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. And the CEV, and I don't remember what that acronym or those letters stand for. But it's another version that I found on Bible Gateway. And it says the Scriptures teach that every complaint must be proven true by 2 or more witnesses. Have you noticed that these versions don't all say the same thing? Some of these versions imply that the 2 or 3 witnesses are not witnesses to the original sin, but rather they are witnesses you bring so that the issue between you and your brother can be clearly understood and clearly recorded, that what you say to him and against him and what he says in response has witnesses to it, right? It says that every charge, in ESV, every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. So that kind of can lean either way, because you think about charge being established, but then you think about evidence, right? The New King James Version, the American Standard, and then they're much closer to by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established, right? There's that idea that what the witnesses are there to establish is not the sin, but the conversation to be had, the communication that is happening. And so I think because among these translations there's kind of a lack of clarity here, as some say one thing, some say another, some lean towards one way, some lean towards the other, I think it's important to really understand, because this is one of the key verses when it comes to rebuking someone, when it comes to confronting a brother, communicating with a brother who has sinned against you specifically, which is where emotions can get really high, right? If someone goes out and they drink, and you catch them drinking, right? And you need to confront them and rebuke them, that's one thing to do, and that's not, emotions may not get very high on your side doing the rebuking there. But if somebody has wronged you specifically, then emotions can get high on both sides. And then it can get messy. And so it's very important that we kind of nail down what this verse means. And so I went back through Strong's, back through the Greek, and I took each word and each Strong's definition for it, and I got it side by side in a table here. I'm not going to attempt at all to pronounce the Greek side, but we're just going to go through the English side, word for word. The first word is that, or in order, or so that. Mouth, 2 or 3 witnesses, every, and then speech, or thing spoken, or sentence is established, is set, stands. So if you look at the Greek, just kind of individual word by individual word, what that implies for this verse is that what you're bringing is witnesses, not witnesses of the original sin, but you're bringing witnesses to the conversation, right? Witnesses to the speech, to the thing spoken, to the sentence, that they can establish it, that they can set it. Those are the witnesses that this verse is talking about. Now, in the Old Testament, on the law of Moses, you needed 2 or 3 witnesses. You could put someone to death with the accusations of 2 or 3 witnesses, right, to the sin itself. But we shouldn't confuse that with this here. Just because they both ask for 2 or 3 witnesses doesn't mean they're asking for 2 or 3 witnesses to the same exact thing. This is asking for witnesses to the conversation, to the communication, because one-on-one didn't work. This is not asking for witnesses to the sin. And we can think about it with logically. Logically, really, you understand it that way. Does it make sense for a Christian to become immune to rebuke just because only one person experienced it? Only one person saw it? If and this is an extreme example, right? If I revealed myself in inappropriate clothing to one other person of the congregation, but then denied I did it, does that mean nobody could rebuke me for doing so? Does that mean if I denied it and there wasn't any camera in the room, then all of a sudden I'm immune to it? And I could do it over and over again, as long as I was careful that there was no evidence or no one else that could have witnessed it. Now, granted, I would go to hell. That doesn't keep God from knowing at all. That's not what I'm saying. But that prevents the church from rebuking me for it. And that doesn't make sense. That's not logical. Why even go to a brother alone to begin with if you need 2 or 3 witnesses to confirm that there was sin? Right? It's not logical. Let us also be clear in this situation that this situation is specific. This situation does not apply to every sin ever. This situation, this passage here, applies to if a brother sins against you and not for all sins. So moving forward, last little bit about rebuke before we close out past this one passage. We were, I guess, really also to summarize, because we never did get to step 3 now, did we? So after we take those 2 or 3 people that can witness the accusations, not witnesses of the sin, we move to step 3. And step 3 is we bring it before the congregation. And if that doesn't work, then treat them as a tax collector or a Gentile. Now, I will say here, I think, is where my biblical knowledge may fall a little short. And if someone can tell me which way this applies, that would be beneficial. But it says, then treat them as a tax collector or Gentile. I'm not sure if the Bible, or I haven't caught whether that's specific to the individual or to the congregation. And maybe that's a thing to think upon, a thing for us all to study, is whether or not this treat as tax collector and Gentile, that's the same as withdrawing from, that's mentioned in other parts of the Bible, or if that's something to be done on an individual level. Perhaps because there may not be any other evidence. That's something I think to be thought about, maybe to be studied in more detail. But moving forward beyond that verse, it says, rebuke those who persist in sin publicly. Right? So this is different. This is not the one-on-one. Right? This is not someone has sinned against me. This is, I pass by the bar on 431 and I see so-and-so's car parked there every Saturday. And we've confronted them. I've confronted them. Somebody else has confronted them. Right? And they keep doing it and they keep doing it. And so you call them out on it. 1 Timothy 5:20 says, here we go. As for those who persist in sin, rebuke them in the presence of all, so that the rest may stand in fear. And I will say that doesn't have to be the congregation. You don't have to pull me aside because you found me drinking over and over again and stand me in front of the congregation here and chew me out for it. You can do it at the bar. Right? Now, normally, we talk about Christians avoiding bar, but if you storm into that bar and you start yelling at so-and-so that they're a Christian, they ought to know better, they don't need to be there, that follows this verse pretty accurately, right? And I say yelling, once again. We need to do these things without anger. We need to do these things with patience and gentleness. So maybe you just come up and say, you don't need to be here, right? This is bad. Say it where people can hear, though, because this verse says you can. This verse says, rebuke them in the presence of all so that the rest may stand in fear. Right? That guilt that then goes to that person because you've caught them again in that sin may then transfer to everybody else that's with them, and they may think, well, maybe I don't need to be here either. It may set people on the path to correction. Some people, though, they won't accept rebuke. Proverbs 8:9 says, do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. The word for scoff here can also be translated as boast, or mock, or scorn. Really anyone that just that is known for having a real bad attitude. Right? They're proud, they mock others, they're scornful, they're scoffing. Right? Those kind of people, they're not going to take rebuke. Right? And sometimes you just got to accept it. And you got to go forward with the other steps the Bible gives to deal with someone that won't take rebuke. Whether it be in the one-on-one like we talked earlier, or we've had many, many sermons on withdrawal and how that works. But this verse also says if you want to this verse really says, it doesn't say if you want to be, but it implies that if you want to be wise, then you accept reproof, you accept rebuke, right? If valid, mind you. You do your studying in your Bible, you do your meditation on what the actions were, because that's what Proverbs says. It says, reprove a wise man and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, he will be still wiser. It increases our wisdom. When people correct us, when we mess up, that's that listener side of communication. I know I focused a lot tonight on the speaking side, but the listener side is just as important. We are to pay attention when we are rebuked. Beyond that one verse in Proverbs, we have more verses in Proverbs. 12:1 says, whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. Whoever ignores instruction, Proverbs 15:32, despises himself, but he who listens to reproof gains intelligence. Have you ever hated yourself? Have you ever just really had self-loathing for something you've done or a situation you're in? While you may not realize it, if you deny rebuke, if you deny reproof or instruction when you need it, then that's that same result there. That's you despise yourself by not listening when people are giving valid complaints to you, when you are in the wrong and need to be corrected. Hebrews 12:11 says, "For the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." Right? Discipline hurts, right? It can get you emotional, although the Bible warns us to refrain from that, to guard ourselves, have self-control against those negative emotions. And it hurts, it's painful. The guilt and all that comes from it. But the reward is great. It says, later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So let's summarize tonight's sermon, and then it will be yours. Communication is not easy. It's hard. And I don't think anybody's a perfect communicator or a perfect speaker or a perfect listener, perfect writer, perfect reader. Right? Those people don't exist. And because of that, right, because what we want to say may not be what comes out of our mouth. Because, tonight there's been 2 or 3 times where I was at a loss for words because the exact words I was looking for just didn't go. I couldn't encode them properly. What we say may not be what is heard. Noise may get in the way. A phone call may break up and only half the sentence may come through. We may have a spelling error in our article or in our text message that may not only just make the sentence a little funnier to read, but may change what is actually understood because we've just put an entirely different word there. Right? An image, a video, a photo that we intend to communicate one thing may communicate something else. And then what is heard may not be what is understood as well. And because of all those things, because of that, as both a speaker and a listener, as both a sender of information and a receiver of it, whether it be through written word, spoken word, action, we need to understand that we are imperfect and have that mercy, have that patience, have that gentleness with each other when it comes to that. We think carefully before we speak. We listen. We pay attention. We do not speak corruptly or with bitterness, anger, wrath, clamor, slander, or malice. We be gracious. We do not speak before we've heard. We adjust our communication to match the audience. We avoid irreverent babble, crude jokes, foolish and obscene talk. We control our thoughts because controlling our thoughts both to avoid sin and to be guided towards righteousness. They help control our mouth, help control our words, our actions, our ways, many, many, many ways we communicate. We are to be a good example in our communication, both to Christians and to non-Christians. We are to be ready to defend the faith. We should not let communication with non-Christians corrupt us. We should show clear disapproval for sin. We should not quarrel or bicker or fuss or be contentious. We are to encourage others. We are to build them up, both Christians and non-Christians. How is a non-Christian supposed to become a Christian if you don't encourage them? And then when rebuking others, we are to follow biblical guidelines. Do not stray from the Bible because the Bible is what's perfect. We are to be gentle. We are to be patient. And we are to be authoritative when we rebuke. As I said earlier, if you feel like your authority is a little wavy on rebuking someone, then don't rebuke them until you have the biblical evidence, the biblical authority to do so. And as always, we'll offer the invitation. I know I haven't spoken really much about baptism or the plan of salvation, but that opportunity is always there to anyone who feels the need. That anyone who has heard the word of God, anyone who has believed it, anyone who wants to repent of their sins, who wants to confess that Jesus is the Christ, who wants to be baptized and become a child of God, that opportunity is always here. And this is not only to the people in the building, this is to the people online. Right? It is easy to find somebody, to find a congregation. Relatively easy. Who will help you become a Christian, who will help you take those necessary steps. Whether that be someone listening to this live or someone listening to a recording. You can find someone. You may have to, depending on where you live, you may have to drive a few hours. But I'll tell you what, I would drive for weeks if it would save my soul. And I doubt you have to drive that far. And then, of course, if there's some sort of error in your life, if you strayed from Christian communication in any of the ways I've mentioned tonight, or if you have an entirely irrelevant issue to the sermon, just because I preached on communication doesn't mean you have to only ask the Christians here for prayers related to my sermon. If there's anything you struggle with, even if it's not a sin you're actively in, even if it's just something that's just a constant temptation for you, you can come to the front, you can make that known to us so that we may help you with prayers and encouragement, with communication, both to you and to God. Because what's the song, Somebody to Lean On? I think it mentions that, I can't remember the exact lyrics right now, but it mentions that you can't know that somebody needs help unless they tell you. And so you need to communicate to us if you're struggling. That way we can help. That way we can communicate to you. That way we can all pray and communicate to God for you.